This is Join Us in France, episode 19. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise.
And we welcome you to the Join Us in France travel podcast. Elise is a professional tour guide, art historian, and a really good storyteller.
A yakker.
And on today's show, we'll be talking about the history of cheese in France and how French people go crazy for cheese.
Cheese, please.
And why you should really try some on your next visit and maybe get a little bit more adventurous than your regular English speaker. I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll try to talk
Living
to it.
dangerously, right?
That's right. So, we've received some inquiries about the possibility of doing Join Us in France tours and visits. We're working on some dates for 2015, and we'll be announcing them in the next few weeks. If you want to hear more about this, do one of two things. You can first you can email info@joinusinfrance.com. Okay? Or you can go to the website, joinusinfrance.com, and on the left column, you'll see a green button, and there's a box where you can enter your email. Enter your email, push the green button, you'll be subscribed to the website, and then you'll get updates via email. Okay? So, as simple as that. Now, don't worry if you can't take notes. You can find all our show notes on joinusinfrance.com/ and the number 19. Now, let's have a little music. I don't know, I might have to get up and get some cheese, Elise.
We may get a little bit pasty now by the end of this one.
And then we'll come right back and talk about cheese.
Okay, so today, Annie, we are going to talk about one of your favorite things in the whole world.
Yes.
Yes, I know. And
I
that
am
is-
weak.
You are weak. Your will is weak. Your mouth is strong. It is cheese. Right?
Oh, yes, you're right.
Well, I have to say, of course, that in preparing my notes for the podcast, I was reading all kinds of different articles and looking at pictures on internet, and I just started salivating in the middle of it.
It's terrible.
So there are some stains on these papers that I'm reading from. That's why. But yeah, I mean, you can't have a podcast called Join Us in France and not talk about cheese.
Agreed. Even if we're not cheese specialists. We've never made, I have made cheese actually.
You did?
I have a very simple fromage blanc.
Uh-huh.
Yes, because when I lived in the US for long stretches of time, I couldn't take it that I didn't have my favorite cheese, the fromage blanc for dessert. I just love that.
Yeah.
And so
They don't know what that is.
no, we'll tell them eventually.
If they're good.
So I made my own for years. So
Well, I made my own yogurt, but we're not talking about yogurt.
That's
We're
right.
talking today about cheese, which is something altogether different.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I'd begin because I was sort of curious myself, looking up the etymology of the word fromage, which is, of
Yes.
course, the word for cheese in French,
yes,
which is quite different from the English word.
yeah, that's true. Never thought of that.
And believe it or not, it actually, the etymology comes from the word forma, which got distorted and actually became froma, which eventually became fromage.
Oh.
And the word forma was actually the word for the mold with the holes in it that allows the curds in the whey to be separate.
I see.
In other words, the earliest kinds of cheese, as you can imagine, were the kinds of cheese where milk was put into basically a wooden form, and it had holes so that the liquid would drain out. and it curdled. And in fact, historically, and this was fascinating. You know how I get crazed when I start going into the past and the past and the past about all these things, you know.
Yep.
There are images on the inside of the pyramids that showed cheese making.
Really?
Yeah.
In the
Guess what?
pyramids?
You won't believe this. I should have made a bet with you to see if I could win a bottle of wine over this one. You're like, what
might
is
have
the
won.
oldest? What are the oldest remnants of things found that have to do with cheese making? Do you want to make a guess?
Well, okay, you took me to the pyramids. So the oldest remnants, some sort of a mold with holes in it.
Yeah, but like, would you want to give me a time frame? You want to try?
Oh well, if it's Egyptians, it's a long time ago. It's like
She's stumbling. She's stumbling.
2,500?
More. I won't even. You're gonna torture yourself over this one. You know, actually, believe it or not, in the Sumerian Basin, which of course is now where Iraq is, there are images that show that cheese was made 5,000 BC.
5,000.
5,000 BC.
Oh,
right?
goodness gracious.
Yeah, it's actually. This is what's so fascinating. Cheese comes from the Mediterranean basin. It doesn't come from Northern Europe, which is what I always used to think. It comes from the area where there were many, many sheep and goats, because when the tribes basically were still semi-nomadic, they would take, they used to use the stomach of an animal as a gourd for carrying liquid and for food stuffs as well.
Yes.
And since they traveled with milk, eventually the milk would curdle and be a little bit sour. And it was really the very first form of cheese. And
I think rennet,
rennet is the stuff that's on the lining of the stomach.
Right, so the natural stuff comes from the stomach.
It's from the stomach, which is, that's why, right?
Okay.
So what's interesting is that, in fact, a feta cheese, which is a cheese everybody knows about, it's one of the oldest forms of cheese because it's what is called a fresh cheese. In other words, it's just made by the milk turning and the adding of some salt and the rennet, which of course is now
naturally
added.
Right, now we add it.
Now we add it, but was naturally added. So strangely enough, cheese goes back very, very, very far. And it was, I don't think anybody really knows at that point, which was really pre-written history, whether cheese was considered to be something that was an everyday product or it was something that was a special product. But by the time we get to the Greeks and the Romans, our favorite peoples talking about the past, they have cheese as one of the staples of their diet.
Well,
now the Greeks still eat feta cheese. A lot, actually.
So do Americans.
So do Americans. But it was the Romans, good old Romans. I love the Romans for all the things that they actually spread around. They were the ones that started inventing different kinds of cheeses. And they were the first ones, as far as we know, who created what we call now hard cheeses. And they took everything else. They took their grapevine cuttings and they took their olive oil in jars. And wherever they went, they took all of this stuff with them. And so when they came to Gaul, because of course we're coming back to France with this story.
Right.
When they came to Gaul, they brought their cheese-making techniques. And we have a wonderful Roman historian from actually not that long ago, because Pliny the Elder, who is one of the first great historians who lived basically at the very beginning of our era. He wrote this enormous multi-volume book on the natural history of the world. And he talked about cheese. And he said that cheese was a significant part of everybody's diet and that it was a wonderful thing to eat.
Yes.
So
it sure is.
You don't even have to be French to appreciate the fact that cheese is a wonderful thing to eat.
See, there's hope for all y'all out there.
There's hope for everybody. And we're not even going to mention cholesterol. That's not a word we're going to talk about today.
No.
Not at all.
No.
So actually, what happened was when the Romans arrived in Gaul, the Celtic tribes were making basically a kind of cottage cheese also, but they learned these other cheese-making techniques from the Romans. And when Pliny the Elder wrote about all of this, he was told by one of the generals of the Roman army that they considered that the best cheeses came from a region that you and I know about. It's not that far from where we are, and that is, believe it or not, the region around Nîmes. Mm-hmm. Which is very interesting because it's not the place I would have expected that they would talk about as a cheese-making place. Well, Nîmes, for those of you out there...
Today, they're not famous for any...
No, they're famous more for their wines than for their cheese. Yeah. But it's actually further up into the area called Lozère and all of that, where you have colder winters. And, of course, for a very, very, very long time, cheese was either goat or sheep. Mm-hmm. Cow cheese is a fairly recent evolution.
Is it?
Yeah, because until the last few centuries, there weren't really huge herds of cows. You know, you would have a few cows for having simple milk. And then, of course, cows were basically used for meat. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't an enormous amount of herding of cows in the way there was going back to prehistory with sheep and goats.
That's true.
Which, of course, can live in terrain that doesn't require a lot of green grass and things like that. Mm-hmm. So really, when we talk about cheese, for a very long time, we're talking about goat and sheep, which, of course, is feta. Feta is basically a sheep cheese.
Yeah. Even today in France, a lot of the cheeses are made from goat's milk.
Yes, well, believe it or not, I was
still
looking up the statistics so that we could talk about them. And interestingly enough, to my great surprise, today, 87% of all cheese is cow cheese.
Oh, that's more than I figured.
It's much more than I figured, too.
Because in my fridge, there's usually 50-50.
It's usually 50-50. But that's because you and I really like goat's cheese, right? Goat cheeses. Yeah. And of course, there are some people who really don't. And
I think it's healthier for you too. At least that's what I've heard, that it's not as fatty or whatever.
Well, this is what I have heard and I've been told.
And we're not doctors either.
No. This is the kind of stuff you talk about when you sit around the table. You know, in France, everybody out there should know that when you're eating in France, what do? You talk about food. You see, so this is what life is like in France. You eat and you talk food. I mean, it's basically one of the major preoccupations. Right, exactly. It is apparently true, and of course, I do some local visits every once in a while that are cheese tasting visits, and I asked one of the people in one of the cheese shops, what is the story about digestion of the different kinds of cheeses? And he said that it's actually, what you're saying is absolutely true. The easiest cheese to digest is goat cheese. And it has to do, believe it or not, with the actual size of the globules of fat in the cheese. And for whatever reason, chemically, goat cheese is closest to human milk. And so it is really the easiest one to digest. And in order of ascendance or descendants, if you want, it's goat, cow, and sheep. Sheep is actually the one that is the richest. And therefore a little bit more difficult to digest if it's a hard cheese. Now, so you have to not consider feta as one of these.
So in French, the difference between... So goat is fromage de chèvre. And sheep is what?
Brebis.
Brebis. Okay, I get it.
Okay, and of course, you know that sheep's cheese is almost exclusively cheese that comes from the mountains.
Usually, yeah.
Where goats can be either mountain cheeses or, it doesn't matter, they can be down in the plain because there are herds of goat in areas like terrain and things like that.
Because in my mind, I wasn't making the I wasn't separating the two. To me, goat, chèvre and brebis.
No, they're different.
It's kind of bonnet blanc, blanc bonnet, same thing.
And sheep cheese is, of course, much stronger tasting in general. Although in all the categories, to not get people confused, we're talking about the origin in terms of the animal origin. Besides the origin, cow, sheep, or goat, you also have, and we'll talk about it in a minute because I would like to just say a little bit more about the history of cheese, but you also have the difference between fresh cheese, soft cheese, semi-soft cheese, hard cheese, and all of those can be any of those three. In other words, any of those. It could be cow, sheep, or goat, and still be any of those categories. So you have the consistency and the taste as one kind of determination, and then the animal it comes from basically as the other.
Right, because in America, if you think goat cheese, all you have is pretty much a soft spread kind of cheese. Yeah.
And here, of course, most of it is semi-soft and not so spread. It can be a little bit spready, but it's not.
Yeah.
So let's just talk a little bit more about the history.
Yeah, go back to the history.
This is so fascinating. So, like with a lot of things, like remember with champagne and with certain other things, guess who was responsible for the keeping of cheese techniques? It was the monks. The monks in the monasteries,
the
right?
The drinkers.
They drank and they ate.
Well, if they have the wine, they might as well have the cheese.
You might as well have the cheese.
They need bakers now.
Yeah, well, the baking came apparently a little bit later. According to one of the things I read, it said that, in fact, the cheese-making technique actually came a little bit earlier than the wine-making technique. I'm questioning whether that is really true. My guess is that they were simultaneous. But it really is up to the monks. And it was the monks, thanks to the monks, that during the period that we all know of as the Dark Ages, which is basically between 500 and 1000 AD, when we have all these incredible invasions of different groups of people, different tribes and groups coming in from Eastern Europe, from the steppes, from Northern Europe, that there's a basic destruction of the fabric of society. We have to really put it that way. A lot of learning is lost. A lot of construction is destroyed. It's really thanks to the monasteries that certain things were kept. And one of them was the ability to know how to make different kinds of cheeses. And starting again in about the year 1000, you have a renaissance in the sense that there's a huge economic boost in society. There's a huge demographic boost. In other words, there's a huge number of people who are born. There's an increase in population. And that is when cheese, interestingly enough, starts to be for peasants, because before that, it was really for the aristocrats. It's very interesting, the change. Now we don't think of cheese as being an aristocratic food at all. But under the Romans, it was for the wealthy. It was considered to be a sign of privilege to have cheese. And starting in approximately about the year 1000, it was the peasants who basically lived on good hard bread, dark bread, and cheese, because they were the ones that would keep a couple of animals and they would take it and use it for their own consumption. In other words, it wasn't for sale.
Right.
It wasn't really an economic activity until the Renaissance, which really is taking us up to about 500 years ago.
Yeah.
And for some reason...
Fast forward a lot there.
Yeah, we fast forwarded a lot, but, well, cheese doesn't keep that long, but it can keep for a while, but don't try keeping it for 1,000 years, But starting in the 1600s, cheese became very fashionable. And there was a writer who actually said, and I'm not sure if I would agree with this now, but at the time, he said that it would be a wonderful gift to give your lady love.
Aww.
Now, I don't know if I would really like a piece of cheese as a gift for Valentine's Day.
Depends on the cheese.
But there is a cheese called Neufchâtel, which is in the shape of a heart.
That's right.
And it is rather delicious.
Neufchâtel is very nice.
Very, very nice.
Beautiful,
right?
yeah.
So when we finally get up to Versailles and the kings of France, cheese is one of the things that is definitely on the table.
Yeah. Okay, I got to tell you a story. A few years back, we went to visit the town of Roquefort, which is not very far from Millau.
Yes, which is a beautiful area.
Beautiful area. And we visited one of the cheese houses.
Right.
And I would recommend, actually, if you're in that area. It's a nice thing to do. And the cheese house, there are 3 or 4, and the one we visited was Société, which is
a big brand.
Big brand. And in there, they have this kind of, so they get you down into the, under the ground. I mean, you're inside of their facilities, and a lot of it is underground. And
a grotto, you could call it.
Yeah, I guess a grotto. And they have this little short film that starts the presentation that tells you how Roquefort cheese started. And pretty much it boils down to God did it.
God did it.
God did it. So they have this, I can't remember, I think it's the Hallelujah chorus or something. I don't remember what it was, but it was
They were singing in the background.
booming music, and you see the finger of God like in the Sistine Chapel projected on the walls, and they tell you that that's who invented the cheese, and then they tell you that this young sheep herder had some milk in his pack, and he went after this beautiful young lady in the hills, and at one point he was tired of carrying his pack, and so he put his pack he hid it in a grotto to keep it from the sun and the rain and all that. And then he was gone for several days trying to find this young lady. And then when he came back, eventually, we don't know, I don't remember if he found the lady or not. His cheese had miraculously, the milk that he had turned into Roquefort cheese. And this is when they have the Hallelujah chorus and the, ta.
You know what? When I went to Roquefort, we didn't go into Society. We went into Papillon, which is one of the other brands, and the story was completely different.
So they made it up.
So they made it up, And in fact, there was no Hallelujah chorus in the background. But in fact, it's amazing because the story was a totally different story. It was about a monk who had actually left a piece of dried bread on top of a piece of cheese down below because it is really underground. It's underground level. It's where the temperature is very much, it's humid and it's the same temperature all year. And apparently he had left a piece of bread, which was probably a dark bread with some rye in it, because those are the ones that get moldy very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how long he'd left it there. They didn't exactly say how many days or hours.
Maybe he didn't go after a woman.
It had nothing to do with women, no. And it didn't have anything to do with the finger of God either, in fact. But anyway, he apparently came back after, I don't know whether it was a day or a couple of days, and the mold from the bread had entered into the cheese. Right. And of course, for those of you out there who don't know it, the mold in blue cheese is in fact penicillin.
Yes.
And it is really very good for you. And
yes.
What they do now is they inject it. It's very rarely done naturally because they really need to control it for sanitary reasons. Mm-hmm. But in fact, it is the mold that was introduced into the cheese that became what they call, the word in French is persillé.
Yes.
Yes.
Persillé, yep.
Which is a very nice word, and I don't know exactly what you would translate into because you can't say parsley in English. It doesn't somehow work.
Because persil is parsley.
It's filled with little green things.
Yeah, green bits, like a stew in which you add some parsley.
Right.
It kind of
Yeah. So a little bit more about the history before we start talking about cheeses today and the different kinds of cheeses and everything. Something I mentioned, Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman. In the days of Charlemagne, the great emperor of not only France, but of pretty much all of Western Europe, which was the 8th century.
Right.
There was someone who actually wrote his official biography at the time, and Charlemagne is quoted as saying that he was given a soft white cheese as a present from somebody. Now, remember, Charlemagne lived up in the north. In fact, his capital was Aix-la-Chapelle, which means it was actually on the other side in Germany, but he was a northern person. And this cheese that was apparently luscious and white and soft. Aww. And he said, why was it that he had never been given this gift before? Well, guess what? That was brie.
Oh.
So they were making brie even back in the 8th century. Wow. Would you believe this? No, she's starting to have a syncope, as they would say. Okay, we're going to have to get to the eating part of this very soon. I would like to make a quote from a gourmet chef, one of the very first who's come down in the history of France, and you can still buy modern versions of his cookbook and his book about food and cooking. He served the kings, and his name was Brillat Savarin. And he said,
What's
Brillat.
Spell.
Brillat.
Okay.
Brillat.
Yes,
Savarin.
yes. I've never heard that name.
He was, I don't believe he was the chef for the king, but he was an Epicurean. And he was part of the court. And he wrote about food and cooking. So he may be one of our first official gourmets. And he said,
Food critics.
a food critic who likes to eat and likes things that go with it, basically a hedonist, because if you hear the quote, he said, dessert without cheese is like a beautiful woman with only one eye.
Oh.
How is that for a metaphor, right? Well, we have one-eyed women, but I guess you don't have one-cheesed or one-eyed desserts. I mean, as people probably don't know, and we'll talk about the rituals of cheese in France in a couple of minutes, but cheese, in fact, is something that is eaten at the end of a meal.
Yes.
So it is considered to be dessert, or actually sometimes dessert or sometimes right before dessert.
Yeah.
But that is the position of eating cheese in terms of a meal.
Yes, it's not an appetizer.
It's not a snack and it's not an appetizer.
Right.
Now, I have another quote from Winston Churchill. We're moving up into the 20th century. And he said, a country with over 400 kinds of cheeses will never be defeated. Long live Winston Churchill. And then, something we had mentioned before, I don't know which podcast we were talking about it, but I remember quoting it, but I'll quote it again. And at the same time, Charles de Gaulle, who of course headed the resistance in London, when he became president and realized that it was a very hard job because the country is very unruly, he said, how can you govern a country that has over 350 cheeses?
Yeah.
Well, the problem is he had his numbers wrong. It's not 350. There are officially over 400. And today it is considered that if you include local cheeses that never leave a specific village, there are actually 1,000 cheeses in France.
Wow. Yeah, because it's getting, I mean, the market is very crowded. So if you are a very small producer and you don't have capability to distribute in like a big supermarket or whatever, then you're always going to stay local. I mean, you're just going to sell to...
You just sell in your local region.
Yeah,
right? On the open air market.
Right, on the farmer's market.
Farmers markets.
Yeah, and there are many of those.
There are lots of... In fact, we were talking earlier about the difference between cow cheese and goat cheese and sheep's cheese. Very often, the local little cheeses are goat cheese because they are usually made, and I'm not exactly sure why, because as you mentioned at the beginning, neither of us is actually a specialist in the world of cheese, but goat cheese tends to be formed in very small pieces, much smaller than the big wheels of cow cheese or even of sheep cheese, interestingly enough. So it's obviously, and it's also a cheese that tends to be made into a fresher cheese that spoils sooner, so it has to be sold locally. So I just thought it would be interesting to hear a few statistics before we actually mention the names of some cheeses and talk a little bit about the different kinds of cheeses. The last statistics that I was able to pick up are, I think, from 2009, 2010, and it says that every adult in France eats 23 kilos of cheese in a year, which is 50 pounds, everybody out there, in case you were wondering. And that is per person. And there are, in that 23 kilos, approximately 15 kilos of aged cheese and about 8 kilos of what is considered to be fresh cheese.
Yeah.
There, in terms of the overall production, France produced in the last couple of years 1.8 million tons of cheese. That's a lot of cheese. That's a lot of milk.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
There's a lot of milking of cows and sheep and goats.
Yeah, yeah.
It is actually a real staple of the diet in France.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, of course, we do know that France is the country where people eat in enormous amounts of cheese. And of course, it produces per capita, and considering the size of the country, more cheese than any other country in the world. strangely enough, in the statistics that they give, there's one country that is considered to be a country where people eat more cheese than France. You will never guess. It's Greece.
Oh.
And almost all of the cheese that they eat is either feta or a hard grating cheese like a Parmesan.
Oh, so they must put it in a lot of things.
They must put it in a lot of things because,
Yeah.
of course, in France, one of the whole differences between a lot of places like the United States and here is that we tend to eat cheese here per se. In other words, you eat the cheese. You don't melt it onto dishes, which, of course, you can do a
Right.
little bit. We don't disguise it. We don't mix it in with other things very often.
Yeah, it's unusual. Like traditional French recipes do not call for cheese.
They don't.
Most of them, So we do have cheese, several times a week. I mean, not at every meal.
Don't you eat some every day? Come on, confess. Come on, Annie.
I probably do.
You
actually.
do. Of
There's
course
always,
you do.
There's always some cheese in my fridge.
Of course there
Always.
is. I think that even, and this is something interesting. I can just imagine people out there going, "Oh my God, fat cholesterol."
Yeah.
Well, of course, in France, people just eat smaller amounts of everything, and so there is much less of this obsession with whether you can eat something or not. Although it is true that in the last 15, 20 years, there has been a lessening of the consumption of cheese by women, particularly women over, let's say, 40, because they're worried about their diet, they're worried about their weight. But in general, mostly what people tend to do is simply just have a very small amount of cheese.
Right.
Because it's a pleasure.
You don't. I mean, I can't fathom having a family occasion where I don't serve cheese at the end of the meal. Now, very often, we don't eat that much of it. You eat. I mean, okay. So this is how it's going to work at my house. I'm hosting a big dinner. I have 15 people over, and at the end of the meal, I've bought maybe 5 different cheeses. But maybe only a tenth of that gets eaten because everybody will have a little flavor of a little something, and we just don't eat big quantities of it.
Except for a few people we know. We'll leave those out. But yes, you're absolutely right. That is exactly what happens. And of course,
But
what happens, people do save cheese and they keep it for a few days or even a week at a time in a special cheese container in the refrigerator and take it out just an hour or two before you're going to eat it.
Right. What does happen is when visitors come from the US or something, they tend to eat more of it because they're more curious and they
They're
want
more
to
curious,
try,
right.
And that's fine. But French people, they know exactly their favorite. So at the end of the meal, they might have a little slice of their favorite cheese on the platter. And of course, if you want to please everybody, you need to have
A little of
different-
everything.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. So each person will find something. But I find it very, very civilized.
It's a civilizing factor, let's say that. Well, of course, you always have to have some wine with the cheese and then a little bit of bread too. So
Yeah.
it is true that in terms of the taste buds, there really is a complementary quality to having a little wine, specifically, ironically, red wine
Yeah.
with cheese, even though now there's a loosening up of the idea of what kind of wine you have with what. But
typically with
even
cheese.
typically, even someone like me who has a tendency now to prefer white wines, I know that if I'm going to have a little bit of cheese, it is really a nicer combination to
Yeah.
taste with some
Yeah.
red wine. In France, there are 45 regions designated as AOC for cheese. Now,
Okay.
AOC means Appellation d'origine contrôlée.
Yes.
I hope I did that with a nice accent.
Appellation d'origine contrôlée.
Yes.
Yes.
Which means that the milk must come from a specific region for the cheese to have the name of that region. And just like with wine, that is the way cheeses are very often designated. Now, some people might not know that the cheese Brie comes from the region called Brie.
Yeah.
Camembert is a little bit different. There is a village called Camembert.
Yes, there is.
But in fact, it's the region of Normandy. Some of the harder cheeses that people might know, Comté, which is a cheese that you and I both
We
love,
love that, yeah.
comes from the Jura Mountains, which is part of the Alps. Emmenthal is a region. Gruyère is a region. A cheese that's similar to Comté that I love called Beaufort
Oh, yeah.
is a region.
Actually, when I have a family over, I often buy some Comté and some Beaufort, and I try to have them guess which one is which. And the flavor is close, but I can tell.
Yeah, I can tell too, I think.
Yeah,
I think I
yeah.
can. There's a nice soft cheese that's similar to Camembert called Coulommiers, which is the name of the town. And these are some of the examples of these AOC cheeses.
Right.
Now, this is not every cheese. But there's another one that I like that you don't like that much, Cantal, which I
Yes.
happen to love.
Little bit.
And Roquefort, which is, of course, the blue cheese that everyone knows that comes from the town of Roquefort.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know why Cantal just doesn't do it for me.
Oh, and see, I love it too.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a little bit. It's the cheese that is closest in its aged form to a cheddar in terms of its texture.
Oh, but I love cheddar.
But you don't like.
I
Well,
don't
we'll
like
have to have
Cantal.
a cheese off one of these days. So, talking about types of cheese, we were talking about that earlier before we even started. Basically, you have fresh cheese,
Right.
which is very similar, of course, to a cottage cheese, but not in curds. It's usually in
Right.
one big piece, and
So
it's
this is
spreading.
This is where I need to explain the fromage blanc thing. It's kind of a yogurt, but it's a little bit.
It's whipped.
Yes, it's a little bit harder. It's whipped. It's very flavor. I like. I mean, no, it's not very flavorful, but it's just has this nice feel in the mouth, and I prefer that to yogurt.
You prefer that to
Yeah,
yogurt.
yeah.
I actually prefer yogurt, but fromage blanc, it's interesting because I know I have some other American friends who live here who actually don't like it. It's got the consistency of very thick sour cream,
Yes.
usually, but it's not acidic like sour
No,
cream.
it's not acidic. No.
And it can either be something that's been whipped up,
Mm-hmm.
or it's a cheese that's basically simply the curds that have been mashed together so that it doesn't have the separate curds like cottage cheese,
No, it
but it's
doesn't, yeah.
basically in that category.
Yeah.
And of course, in France, it's something that's very often used for dessert with either a red berry sauce or some honey whipped in between it. Now, of course, there are people who love it, as you do.
Yeah.
That is one category. You have the fresh cheeses. Now, remember, that can be any kind. It can be a cow cheese, a goat cheese, or a sheep cheese. Those are the mildest, of course.
Yes. Yes.
And they're soft. As the cheese gets older, it gets harder because the moisture leaves.
Right.
The older cheeses are generally a little saltier. So we have the special category, which is separate, which is blue cheeses. In France, there is not just Roquefort. There are quite a few other blue cheeses. There's one that's from the region around Lyon. There's the Bleu d'Auvergne. There's another. There are about 5 or 6 blue cheeses that you get in
Yes.
France. However, all of them are cow cheeses except for Roquefort, which is sheep's cheese,
Right.
sheep's milk. Then you have what they call the soft, uncooked, unpressed cheeses. And that is a category that everyone knows because that is Camembert, Brie, Coulommiers, all of these cheeses that are the kind that squish out. And if they get very, very ripe, they tend to be rather strong. So
Right.
they're
Right.
they're creamy, they're buttery, they're usually very, very good, and they get a little bit powerful when they get older.
Yes.
And these are all of them cow cheeses anyway. This is from milk from cows. And this is largely cheeses, mostly, not all, but mostly from the northeast and northwest, Normandy, Brie, and those areas
Okay.
up north. And then you have the 2 other categories, which is what we were talking about earlier, where it can be a little confusing, that are called pressed cheeses. And you have pressed cheeses that are cooked, which means that the milk has been heated to a certain temperature before it is put into a mold and literally pressed with a huge stone
Yes.
so that all the moisture goes out of it. The ones that are heated are the cheeses like Comté and Gruyère. So those are pressed and cooked in a sense. And then what you don't like, but I love, the ones that are pressed but not cooked, which is Cantal. And then a cheese that I love called Saint-Nectaire.
Uh-huh.
These are cheeses from the central region, the Auvergne region. They tend to be what we would call semi-hard.
Yes. Yes.
And they ripen and get a bit strong. Whereas the very hard cheeses that are in huge wheels, like the Comté and the Gruyère and Beaufort, they get very tasty, but they don't have that certain ammoniac quality when they get old, which a softer cheese tends to get if it gets to be too old. They simply get nice and tasty, but get very, very, very hard.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, in these categories, you have endless numbers of cheeses.
Oh, yeah. Lots of variations.
In the Pyrenees, you have wheels of cheese made from sheep's milk. You have in the Basque Country primarily cheese made from milk from sheep.
Mm-hmm.
And you have mostly hard cheeses, even though there actually are a couple of softer ones.
Yeah.
And they have a tradition which is a little bit different because they tend to have their cheese with cherry preserves. Those are the two things they do as a dessert in the Basque Country. It's very nice, actually.
Yeah.
Because the cheese tends to be very, very strong tasting.
Yeah.
Even though it's not too salty. And the sweetness of the cherry preserves seems to go very, very nicely with it.
Yeah, in France, we serve cheese with, very often, okay, depending on what you're serving and depending on each family. We all do things a little bit differently. But we can serve cheese with honey, or with a cherry jam, or with confit pâte de coin.
Or nuts. Or sometimes I've seen it with walnuts and figs and
nuts,
things like that too.
So depending on who you're, like in America, the classic is cheese with raisins. I mean, with grapes.
With grapes,
right?
Or pears sometimes.
Yeah, we don't do that so much in France. It's usually something very sweet.
Yeah.
That we will use to kind of offset.
If it's a strong cheese.
Yeah.
Some cheeses, of course, in France are not had with fruit at all. They're simply usually eaten with some bread.
Yes, and we never eat cheese with crackers.
Never.
This is not a French thing.
No.
Sorry to disappoint
it's
America.
It's barbaric in France. It would be the strangest thing in the world to pull out a cracker and try and put your cheese on it.
Now, I tried my family because when I moved back from America, I had lived there so long that I had forgotten that you don't serve cheese with crackers. And so at the end of the meal, I would bring out cheese and crackers. And they were like, but nobody ever said anything, but they didn't eat the crackers. They wanted bread,
They wanted bread.
Yeah,
yes.
we eat. Yeah, we eat.
Well, of course, bread is. You just don't serve a meal without bread in France.
No, you don't.
You just don't.
That would be really rude.
You would consider that to be rude. Absolutely. So you have cheese. So again, cheese is not usually served as aperitif in France, even though in some places now they're starting to do that. But basically, it is served after the main dish, sometimes with a green salad, sometimes after a green salad.
Yes.
And in some cases, if it isn't an extremely elaborate meal, it is the end of the meal.
Yes.
Unless you're having a special dessert afterwards, in which case it is the one thing that you do in between the main dish and the dessert. And what you were saying earlier about the eating cheese at the end of the meal, and it made me think about something that you've actually witnessed because you've come over to my house for this, and that is, of course, Thanksgiving, which is a meal that I really, really like to have in a very traditional American kind of way. I mean, it's one of the few moments of the year when my blood bursts with Americanism, and I am obliged by the French contingent of my life to bring cheese out at the end of the meal when it should not be there, because this is not a French meal. But there is something about the cheese at the end of the meal that you cannot not put it out, even if you only eat teeny slivers of it.
Right. If you're serving a fancy meal, you have to have cheese at the end. It's just how it is.
You see?
Yeah,
That's what I'm saying. There's the French contingent. That's the way it goes, I mean, would you go to a Chinese restaurant and ask for cheese at the end of the meal?
No, I would not.
Well, then why for Thanksgiving? But that's another subject altogether. Anyway, I think it is really wonderful. And there are two other things I just want to mention. A lot of people come over to France and they're afraid to taste cheese that is made from raw milk.
Ah, yes. Lait cru.
Lait cru. Now, in France, there are quite a few cheeses that are made with raw milk there are soft cheeses, there are semi-soft cheeses, there are hard cheeses. Even the Comté can be made with raw milk, and it is perfectly safe. It is not because the milk is raw that there are not sanitary controls. All of the foods that are produced in France are very, very carefully controlled by the equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration here, it's the Department of Agriculture, and you will not get sick from eating cheese that is made from raw milk.
Yeah, we have armies of veterinarians checking up on the conditions of how they raise the animals, how they
raise the animals,
how they do all sorts of
things.
They
control for disease, they control for everything else. And it really does sometimes, for certain cheeses, make a difference that the milk has not been pasteurized, has not been boiled up.
And what's a little bit strange to Americans, I think, is that you can have a cooked cheese that's made of raw milk. What that means is they started with a raw milk and then they processed it the way they normally do.
Right.
But those are two separate things.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that a lot of Americans, aside from perhaps cheddar and Monterey Jack, they basically think of cheese as being something that is called processed cheese, which is used a very small amount, a very, very small amount in France, and largely given to children who are not necessarily going to eat a lot of strong-tasting cheeses. But processed cheese in France is not legally cheese. It is officially considered to be a milk product, but it is not cheese. Cheese is something that is basically 99% milk with salt and rennet added to it.
French people have adopted a lot of American habits over the years, but Velveeta cheese is not one of them.
No.
You cannot find that anywhere.
No, the one thing here, of course, which is what everybody knows from their childhood, is the cheese called la vache qui rit.
Yeah, la vache qui rit. Yeah.
Which is, of course, the laughing cow.
Which I have some in my fridge.
You see, there you are. Which is really pretty much the only one that everyone in France knows about. But France is very lucky because it is a country that has extremely rich farmland and has wonderful grasslands, and it has all that is necessary for the production of all kinds of milks and therefore all kinds of cheeses. So all I would like to say now is bon appetit, and where's the glass of wine, Annie?
Well, just a minute. We did break for a little bit of cheese in the middle.
Yes, we did.
Yes,
we didn't tell anybody that.
But we did not break for wine.
No, we didn't. What is wine without cheese, or cheese without wine? I don't know what the world is coming to.
Well, okay, so I think we need to end here, but there is plenty more to say about tourism, cheese tourism in France.
Yes, there is.
There are many places where you can visit, organize visits and tastings.
I figured it would certainly be far too long, but there is one. I've actually done a couple of these. There are cheese routes. There's a cheese route in the Auvergne area, which is one of my favorite. And
we'll talk about those.
And we'll talk about those too, because those are wonderful circuits. You have wine circuits and you have cheese circuits, and they are wonderful. And everything like that in France is very well indicated.
Yeah.
So if you have a car and you're driving in the countryside, you can stop in many, many different places, and it's really a wonderful thing to do. You're absolutely right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Elise.
Well, thank you, Annie. And thank you for the little tastings of cheese while we're at it.
We have a really good Comté that's like 18 months old. And it's one of those fine ones. It crackles under the...
crackles. You know what it is that's crackling? It's the salt.
It's the salt.
It's the salt crystals.
Oh, those are really good. I so missed cheese when I lived in America. And then Costco started selling a few, 3-4 varieties of cheese.
So, in defense of the United States, there really are 3 major cheese-producing regions. One is upstate New York, which has excellent, and Vermont, cheddars. And in fact, interestingly enough, in the research, I discovered that the first place that cheese was produced industrially was, in fact, in upstate New York in the 1850s. And it was cheddar. So you have Wisconsin, which produces wonderful blue cheese and some soft cheeses, and Oregon. which produces wonderful, wonderful cheeses as well. And even a very good camembert. Now, I know that it's not supposed to be called a camembert because camembert is a designation of a region, but in the United States, people don't understand that. And so, in fact, it is called a camembert. So, yes, there are certain areas that do produce some good cheeses.
Yeah, I've had to go to Wisconsin a fair amount for work, and every time I go, I taste some local cheeses.
Yeah,
and they're really good. I mean, I have
good.
to say, even as a French person, I think that Americans make very good cheese. It's just that they don't make that much of it.
They don't make that much of it, and they don't make that many different kinds.
Right.
Because this is not part of their cultural heritage.
Right. American people don't go eating cheese at the end of every meal. No, neither do French people anymore, but we do buy. I mean, I probably spend, I don't know, per week. How much do I spend on cheese? Maybe 30 euros per week.
I don't know, but you remind me of one last statistic, which was very interesting. 17% of the food budget on average is on dairy products in France.
Yeah.
So it's a big amount.
It's a big amount. Yeah.
Yeah. Far more than meat. Interestingly enough.
Yeah, French people don't eat that much meat. Not big quantities.
No, not big quantities.
It's not that good here, that's why. But we're not going to discuss
No,
that
we're not going
again.
to talk about meat again. Okay. Well, so much for cheese. Have a wonderful cheese day.
Yes, enjoy some cheese today. And when you come to France, definitely.
We will do cheese.
Yes, have some cheese. Be adventurous. If it's stinky and smelly, I have to say, my husband loves stinky French cheese.
Not me.
I don't like it that much either. But he really goes out of his way to try very offensive smelling cheeses.
How can you try an offensive smelling cheese? It's so interesting.
Well, it's because he's a singer, and so he participates in some choirs. And after a performance, one of the typical things that people bring
is
cheese, and they get a rise out of having the American try really way out there cheeses.
And we really do have to stop. But interestingly enough, the region of France that is known for having the most smelly cheeses is Burgundy.
Burgundy, huh?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't like those so much, but I will try.
But we can go for the wine, you and I.
Oh, yeah, the wine.
Okay, we better stop, Addie.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. We'll talk to you again next Saturday. And remember, if you are interested in more information on upcoming tours and visits, go to joinusinfrance.com and enter your email address where you see the little subscribe green button, and then you'll be receiving updates in your email. And we will not spam you because I hate spam.
We will not.
And I will not hate myself. So I won't do it to you. Very good. Thank you. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
À samedi prochain.